Hey there, I'm Jennifer Bourne of jenniferbourne.com, and today I'm talking about 3 different ways that you can handle an unresponsive client. If you have been plagued with clients that go unresponsive for whatever reason, clients that go MIA in the middle of a project, this is for you. From the client missing a deadline to third-party integration issues, there are all sorts of reasons that digital agencies, freelancers, web designers, developers may run into project delays. But there is one above all others that absolutely drives all service providers totally crazy, and it's an unresponsive client. If you have been selling website services, design development services, if you're a freelancer of any way, you have likely had a client go MIA in the middle of a project. And it leaves you wondering, what the heck is going on? And you're stuck, unable to move the project forward because you're waiting for feedback from the client. In this case, you probably have reached out. You probably have reached out by email, by phone, probably multiple times, and maybe you haven't gotten a response. Maybe you're growing more and more frustrated with the disrespect and lack of regard for your time as each new day passes without any response from your client. Unresponsive clients are one of the most challenging type of clients to deal with because there isn't necessarily a conflict to resolve. There isn't a problem to solve. There's just a client that went MIA, and sometimes you have no idea why. Without the proper provisions in your contracts, you can be set up for some really, really uncomfortable, really awkward, and really frustrating experiences. Because if you don't address what happens if a client goes MIA, if a client becomes unresponsive in your contract, you have no clear path of action for how to deal with it. And that is not a good place to be. You don't want to be left holding the bag, just waiting for them to show up again. Don't let that be you. Instead, make sure that your contracts include termination clauses, that your contract dictates and outlines exactly what happens if a client goes MIA, and how it will be handled if they're unresponsive, and how the project is going to be impacted. In addition to the normal cancellation clauses in your contract that enable you or your client to cancel the project at any time with 30 days notice and the payment of applicable fees, there are some other termination clauses that you might want to consider putting in your freelance contract to help you better deal with unresponsive clients. The first is a dormancy clause. A dormancy clause addresses what happens if or when a project falls dormant because a client disappears, right? It outlines the amount of time that has to go by or what the grace period you will give to an unresponsive client is before a project is considered dormant. It outlines what will happen if a client disappears for a specific amount of time with no communication, no warning, no heads up, right? It says, hey, if you completely disappear, this is what's going to happen, right? And this is what happens when you finally do show up again. Another clause is a more robust cancellation clause, right? The cancellation clause takes dormancy one step further. It outlines exactly what happens if a project goes dormant from a client being MIA, and it stays dormant for a certain amount of time. What this does is it gives you an out to cancel the project and to end that client relationship if the project goes totally dormant from the client being MIA, and then it stays dormant for a certain amount of time. That way, it's not hanging over your head. It's not a liability. It's not an open project that is just sitting out there with no clear path to completion. Another clause that you might want to consider using is an expiration date. This is completely separate right? A different kind of situation, but it's a situation that can create problems for freelancers and agencies who are working with clients, especially those that disappear and then show up, and then clients that continually delay projects without making any kind of significant progress. I had a client who would disappear for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And just at the point where the project was about to go dormant, she would show back up and say, "Hey, sorry, this got in the way, that got in the way, this got in the way." But no progress was ever being made. Almost a year went by of that. And because we had no way in our contract of dealing with it, it just kind of hung out there over our head. And as they say, the best contracts come from the worst client situations. So, a lot of delays in website projects specifically happen when it's time for the client to provide content because it's either not done yet or maybe they haven't even started. They're embarrassed and they don't want to admit it, so clients just stop responding. This also happens at the end of the project when the final payment is due and they don't have the funds to make that payment. So without the proper clause in place, you risk being held hostage by the client. And even though you're unable to complete the project, it's still on your project list. It's still in your development account. It's still requiring your attention to care for and maintain. So with this in mind, consider designating an expiration date, at which point your contract will automatically expire and terminate with no refunds. So if you start a project, maybe June 1st, and the launch date is scheduled for July, sometime in July. If the client delays and delays and delays, if they go MIA and they come back and they go MIA and come back, maybe there's an expiration date set for September 1st. That way there's a grace room and wiggle room in there, but that if the project doesn't launch by then because of those client delays, that the contract expires. This isn't one that I love to use, but it's one that I found has saved my tush more than one time over the years. So enforcing it and how to enforce it is up to you. But typically, these days, when I put an expiration clause in a contract, I will say that the contract expires maybe 12 months from the date that it is signed, right? This is really good for those one-off projects. Obviously, retainer projects are a little bit different, but for those one-off projects, it can give you an official end date if you have that client that yo-yos back and forth between being MIA and showing up, but really not making any kind of progress. In all of these situations, dormancy, cancellation, expiration, I have got samples of what you can say and all of that in the blog post that you can take a look at. But let's talk a little bit about what do you do when a client goes MIA? Because it's one thing to have a clause in your contract, but if it actually happens, you have to take action. Even with the proper clause in your contract, you are going to run into clients who disappear in the middle of a project, who go MIA, who delay. And what do you do first? First, make sure you document every single step that you take, right? You need to document every email, every phone call, every bit of outreach. Screenshot that if you need to, whatever it is. So use that sample dormancy, cancellation, expiration clause in this blog post, but also remember, document everything. So at 1 week with no response, send the client an email reminding them that say, "Hey, it's been a week since I've heard from you, and I'm waiting on you to move the project forward. I need you to respond." Ask them to respond. If it's been 2 weeks with no response, check in by email and by phone and be sure to leave a voicemail message. If the client's local and has a place of business, stop in for a visit to see what's going on. Don't be afraid to just show up. At week 3, with no response, check in by email, check in by phone, leave that voicemail message, stop by, connect. If you're connected on social media, reach out. on Facebook, reach out on Twitter, reach out through Instagram direct messages, wherever you're connected with your client. Reach out and try to get in touch with them via private message. Don't do it publicly, but do it private. And at this point, remind the client of the dormancy clause in their contract. Copy and paste that clause into the email or into your message for reference. Communicate that you're reaching out because you want to help them avoid dormancy, especially if there's a reactivation fee once a project goes dormant. At 25 days with no response, check in again by email, by phone, leave that voicemail, check in through social media, do everything you can to get a response. Remind the client of the dormancy clause, copy and paste it into your communications again, and let them know, hey, that deadline is in 5 days. If I don't hear from you in 5 days, your project will go dormant, and then that will require a reactivation fee for us to restart our work. At 30 days of your client being totally MIA, draft an official letter on company letterhead notifying the client that their project has reached dormancy and what those implications are. Send the letter to the client through regular U.S. mail, postal service, and send it to them by email. Consider calling the client to alert them of the change in product status as well, right? You want to make sure you do all your due diligence to connect with the client in all ways available to you, documenting these as you go. Now, 30 days is when dormancy kicks in. At 42 days, with still no response, check in by email, check in by phone, leave that voicemail, remind them of the cancellation clause in their contract. Copy and paste that clause into your communications. Let them know that the deadline's in 3 days. Communicate that you're reaching out because you don't want them to lose out on the investment they've made so far, right? You don't want to have to cancel the project and close out that relationship. At 45 days, draft an official letter on company letterhead notifying the client that it's reached cancellation, that they've basically cut you off. There's been no communication and there's nothing that you can do beyond all of the outreach that you've done to date, and that you haven't gotten responses for any of those, right? Send that letter through regular mail and by email, and again, consider following up with a phone call. The bottom line is that dealing with unresponsive clients is a challenge, but the goal should always be to re-engage that MIA client. Should re-engage them, bring them back in, get the project moving forward, and finish it off strong so that everybody walks away happy, right? Regular check-ins by phone, by email, right? Regular check-ins through social media, direct messaging if you have to go that route, stopping by their office if they're a local business. This often can do the trick to get an unresponsive client re-engaged and back into the project. Sometimes it just requires that little bit of extra digging to find out what is going on. And when you reach out with care, right? When you reach out and say, I haven't heard from you. I am worried about you. Is everything okay? This is what's going on our end. We haven't heard from you. We don't know what's going on, right? This can often make a client who's been unresponsive just because they don't have any good reason kind of feel bad about it. And it can prompt them to send you a response and say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. They'll kind of explain what's been going on, give you some kind of excuse, and then jump back into the project. But do your due diligence. Reach out. The goal, again, is to finish the project strong, to bring the client back in, to get them re-engaged, to finish it so you're happy, so they're happy, so you turn out a project that you're proud of and you're both able to move forward. But with those contract clauses, you've got that at your back just in case you need to enforce those. So next time you have an MIA client, now you know how to handle it and what to do. Thanks for being here. I'm Jennifer Bourne, again with jenniferbourne.com. Make sure you subscribe so you get all the latest articles, videos, and content. And until next time, I hope you have a great day.